All right, welcome back in Live Now from Fox. I'm Austin Westfall. Well, there are two presidential elections taking place this year that should be on your radar. There's the U.S. presidential election taking place on November 5th, but also Iran will be holding a special election later this month to replace former President Ebrahim Raisi. He died, of course, in that helicopter crash in May. The main candidates on Monday discussed Iran's economic problems in a 4-hour live debate on state TV. I believe we have some visuals from that. Let's discuss the international implications of this race with senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Behnam Taleblu. Good to see you. So let's get straight into this. There is a lot to discuss. There were 6 candidates at the debate this week. Do all 6 have a shot at winning? Is there a front runner of sorts?
Well, it's great to be with you, Austin. Just by way of background, it's worth noting that there were 80 individuals, including former parliament speakers, former presidents, including former Holocaust denier-in-chief Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who did attempt to run again for the presidency, and those individuals were vetted and prevented from running by Iran's Guardian Council. That's a 12-member body that actually implements the will of the supreme leader and vets any candidate for public office, making every election in reality in Iran more so a selection. And to that effect, these 6 people, 3 of them are subject to Western sanctions. 2 of them are sanctioned by Canada, 1 by, I believe, the United Kingdom. 5 of them, have ties to service, military service, in fact, in the Iran-Iraq War. That's like their World War II and Vietnam War and Korean War rolled up all into one in terms of the social and political legacy. And in fact, 3 of them were formerly part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is, as you know, designated both by the US as well as Canada as a terrorist organization. It would be a mistake, I think, to look at polling to see who is more popular. This is really a contest for Iran's only voter of consequence, which is the supreme leader. And in the sense, the fact that there's 5 hardliners and 1 token reformist or self-styled reformist tells you, I think, all you need to know, that whoever wins, the Iranian people lose.
That leads me to my next question. How fair are Iranian elections? How would you describe their democratic standards?
Historically, these elections, as scholars and Iran watchers and people even familiar with the wave of elections, or shall we say selections in the Middle East, know these are neither free nor fair. But ironically, in the past, 3 or 2 decades, Iran and Iranians in general, despite knowing that they had an Islamist and authoritarian government, would ironically have relatively high rates of turnout in these otherwise not too competitive selective processes. What you've seen in the past decade, however, is that as major anti-regime protests have grown, participation in these sham elections has diminished significantly, such that there was a parliament election just a few months back that you may recall, where in Tehran, the country's capital, there was less than a double-digit participation rate in that election. And the last presidential election was 2021, where the former President Raisi, who died in the helicopter crash in May that you mentioned, he was brought in with the lowest ever official rate for a presidential election in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic. So not only are these not free, not fair, not genuinely competitive, they're increasingly being shunned by the population because of that fact.
Yeah, as you mentioned, and as we all know, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he sits atop the Iranian hierarchy, but I don't know if the correct question is how powerful is the presidency? What precise jobs does the presidency hold? And I guess, is it more important this election, given that the Supreme Leader himself is 85 years old?
Yeah, let's certainly start with the age of the Supreme Leader. He's currently 85. The 45-year Islamic Republic has only had 2 supreme leaders, and then the election or selection of those 2 individuals or promotion of those 2 individuals, the rule of law has actually not mattered. So in my view, Khamenei is picking or will be picking a hardliner or someone who will be able to continue the legacy of the previous president that was supposed to serve a 4-year term. Let's not forget, Khamenei will be 89 and a half years old by the time this individual finishes their first 4 full-year term. Beyond that, of course, is really what Khamenei and these ultra hardliners like institutions like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps may have in mind for the Iranian population. Remember, this is the Middle East, so things can always get worse, not better, with the passage of time. And what you've seen in electoral contests since 2005 is that yesterday's insider is a regime outsider. So while the regime, because it's brittle, because it's authoritarian, because it's unpopular, cannot really afford any kind of exogenous shocks, and even this election, or shall we say selection, is an exogenous shock. They're doing everything they can to, maintain a tight grip on power. And beyond that, one might wonder if the Iranian president does not have the power of the American president or the power, the legal authority of the French president, why should we be concerned so much? It's because of the paranoia inside this regime in Iran. They're paranoid. They don't want anyone who has any remote independent political standing to pose a threat, even though the Iranian president on paper and as a matter of practice does not control foreign policy and is significantly checked when it comes to domestic policy.
As I mentioned at the top, a lot of what was discussed at that debate earlier this week was the economy. And we all know that the world's powers that may be have implemented a number of sanctions on Iran. But I'm curious, the economic problems have to go beyond that, correct? What kind of economic problems are we talking about?
Oh, yeah. When you look at the sanctions regime, those are really the final layer on a multi-tier, you could say, cake of economic problems that have existed since the inception of the Islamic Republic and have grown as the political elite or religious and political and even military elite have all moved into the formal and informal economy. There's basically a dying, if not dead, private sector in that country. The middle class is squeezed from the top and the bottom. Whether you control for $2 a day or $5 a day, tons of Iranians, almost half, if not more, live below the poverty line, depending on what metric you have. There is graft, there is corruption, there is even corruption among like-minded hardline regime individuals, such that the major fights that you have in Iran today are largely stylistic. They don't disagree, largely, even within one faction, the most dominant faction, the hardline faction, over major policies. They disagree over stylistic issues. And in that sense, no one is challenging the fact that there is a large public sector, that there is government overreach, there is mismanagement, there is corruption. And to the degree that they will talk about these things, they'll use it to point fingers at one another, but never at top where that responsibility should be placed, which is the parastatal organs known as bonyads that exist in Iran that are essentially tax-free. They're called charitable, but they're really not charities, these institutions that wash money. There's the central bank in the country, which is actually funding terrorism. There's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its myriad business interests. And atop all of that is the supreme leader of Iran, his office, and the fact that he has, tons and tons and tons of economic holdings that are, not accounted for.
What is most important to Iranian voters? Is it the economy? Is it something else?
Well, whether it's the economy, whether it's social issues, whether it's religious issues, whether it's environmental or even foreign policy issues, what the Iranian people have shown, particularly since 2017, is they will use any of these myriad issues affecting their lives to make a much larger political point. And really from 2017 to present, in the multiple rounds of boom and bust protests that have been nationwide, geographically and demographically diverse, you've seen them point to political issues, meaning that the people in Tehran, the hard men in Tehran, the government of the Islamic Republic does not represent their views, values, and interests. And that's why fundamentally you have a post-revolutionary society led by a revolutionary regime, an Islamist regime overseeing and controlling a nationalist society, and then fundamentally all of the tension coming from an autocratic regime versus a 100-year plus democracy seeking or representative government seeking population. So the biggest cleavages are political cleavages, and then everything flows from that.
So what will be the international implications for this race? We all know Iran's connection to Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, among other groups spread around the Middle East. What will this race mean for those conflicts?
While, for example, you have had at least one individual, in fact, the sole cleric who is running, Pour Mohammadi, I believe in a tweet, talk about, Iran not really gaining much, or him alleging that Iran is not really gaining much by sending drones to Russia for use against Ukraine. Again, the Iranian president does not control or set foreign and security policy and merely implement this. In fact, you had a major commander, a former commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, talking about the need for the president to make sure their views are in line with the supreme leader. That commander's job now is actually a special advisor to the supreme leader. So as expected, Iran's material and political support to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, the myriad Shia militias that exist in Iraq and Syria, to the Assad regime, and to basically this anti-rejectionist, anti-status quo series of forces, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, Syria, or Venezuela, are unlikely to change because of who is the president of the Islamic Republic.
How would you frame this election to our largely American audience? Why is this of consequence to Americans?
You know, to be blunt, Iranian presidential elections, because they're really selections, don't matter in the day to day, but this one certainly does because it's an exogenous shock imposed on the regime, and the more exogenous shocks the regime has to deal with, the greater the potential for mistakes. So if there are people in Washington listening, there's always the capacity to capitalize on a mistake. That's one. And number two is to have the American people not make the mistake of thinking that the views, values, and interests of the people in Iran are the views, values, and interests of the regime in Iran. You couldn't have one of the biggest dichotomies like the one you do in Iran really anywhere else, where you have fundamentally a pro-American population and fundamentally an anti-American regime. So there's a coarsening, hardline authoritarianism that we see before our eyes and a genuine democracy-seeking movement there. Now, this is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. This is not an artificial country. This is a country with a sense of history and destiny that is really being held back by its leaders, which, as you know, are not elected.
And we'll leave it there for now. We appreciate your insight. Take care.
Thank you.
Let's slide away for a quick 2-minute commercial break. We'll be right back.